Welcome, everyone. This is Bill Daggett, the Executive Chair of the Successful Practices Network, and welcome to our second podcast that Dan Domenech and I are doing. As most of you know, Dr. Domenech had an incredible career as a teacher, local administrator, superintendent, a BOCES superintendent in New York State, superintendent in our Fairfax County, Virginia. But most of us know Dan for his last 14 years as executive director of AASA. And during that time, he had the privilege of working hand in hand with Tom Gensel. Tom is joining us in this podcast. Tom had 40 years of deep service to school boards, where he was the executive director of the Pennsylvania School Board, but then became executive director of the National School Boards Association. During that time, I saw Tom and Dan on a number of occasions in front of live audiences sit and talk about the challenges and the opportunities facing superintendents and boards and how to most effectively make that relationship work. And so we thought that this would be a great second podcast for us to have Tom and Dan have that conversation. So I'm going to just turn the podcast over to Tom and Dan, and I'll join you at the end of the podcast. So, Tom, welcome to our podcast. And Dan, I'm going to say, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bill. And I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be together again with Tom. For many years, Tom and I, twice a year, once at my conference and once at the school board conference, would spend an hour where we would be chatting on superintendent school board relations. So it's great that we can get together again, Tom, to do this. You know, when I was in a young superintendent in New York, my first superintendency, we went to New York State, and at that time, the education commissioner was a gentleman by the name of Ewald Nyquist. And so Nyquist gathered all of the freshman superintendents in his office, and he said to us, you know, ladies and gentlemen, superintendents today tend to leave their districts the same way as they arrived, fired with enthusiasm. Now, that's a line that I have never forgotten. And it seems to me that it's as true today, if more than ever. And so I think that to be able to address, and particularly for our colleague superintendents, the issue of board superintendents relationship, what you and I tend to refer to as the management team, is critical. And I'm glad that you're here with us today, Tom, so we can have that discussion and hopefully provide our superintendent colleagues and board members, if they're listening to the podcast as well, with some examples of how the superintendent and the board working together as the management team of the district can achieve success. But I'd like to start with something that I'm sure is in the mind of many superintendents, and you and I have talked about it already, and that is the split that has occurred at the national level. Whereas for years, the National School Boards Association was the only organization that represented school boards. We now have two. And they seem to be fairly evenly divided in terms of the number of states that they have as members. You were the executive director for years at NSBA, a very successful term during your tenure there. Tell us about what you see that and how it affects basically, particularly school boards at the national level, when instead of just one school board association representing school boards around the country, there are two.
Well, Dan, thank you first of all to you and Bill for inviting me to be part of this. I've really been looking forward to it. I'm going to address your question, and I want to just drop back a little bit and talk about maybe some of the issues that are related to more recent developments. You're right. There traditionally has always been one national organization representing school boards, NSBA. More recently, a second group formed. It was a number of the states that had been members of NSBA that broke off to form a separate organization. There, as you might suspect, the a bit of a history to that, but it really boils down, I think, to some of the cultural issues, some of the political issues that are, kind of tugging at the fabric of our American society, and certainly they affect school districts as well. In fact, I've often said that I think the real strength of school boards is that they're a cross section of America. And that remains true, I think. But that also poses a challenge because, as you know, as Americans, we're not united on a lot of things, including a lot of the key issues that are before us. So I would say that was kind of a big part of why that split happened. Um, I'm a glass half full kind of person, and I'm hopeful that, over time, although this all happened after I left, and I'm sure there's a lot of the history I'm not really familiar with in terms of what actually happened internally, but I'm hoping over time that they'll come back together because I think it's important to have a strong voice at the national level for school governance, and I think that's personally, I think that's best achieved when we have one organization. But again, a lot of this happened after I left, and I'm not familiar with some of the internal developments. But Dan, let me just make one other quick comment about that because um, I think it's probably important to also talk about why school boards actually exist and why they matter, and I think that is something we ought to just kind of keep in front of us. I've always found it interesting as a student of history that every state in our country has local school boards. And there are exception or two. I know Hawaii has a statewide board, but there was no federal mandate to create school boards. This was a governance system that I think is pretty unique to the United States, that we have in each state a requirement for public education vested typically in the legislature of the state, but they in turn have created local governing bodies, school boards, to oversee that system. And I think it comes down to this notion of local community ownership of public education. And so all of this sort of ties back to what I just said, because how different communities view issues, of course, varies quite a bit. That's part of the rich fabric of our country, I think, but it's also one of the challenges we're facing.
So that's a great point, Tom. And let me go back now to superintendents. We have today more than ever, superintendents that are going into the position probably earlier than they might have liked, because again, we have seen such a turnover in the superintendency over the years. So a lot of individuals are rising into the position, perhaps not as prepared as we would like them to be. So, what would you say to an individual that is looking to become a superintendent and is being interviewed by a board for the job? Is it important for the superintendent to try to make sure that the job that they're going to take with a particular board is going to be right for them? And how can they figure that out?
Well, of course, Dan, you ask, as you often do, it's such a profound question because this is, as you and I know, have talked about often, this is the real linchpin of effective school leadership is when the board and the superintendent have a shared vision about where the district needs to go. And so I think it's, a lot of factors go into hiring and making this decision. Uh, some of it is, is there a good fit? Does the person sort of understand the community values, the prospective superintendent? Um, but I think it also relates to responsibility on the part of the board. I mean, I've been concerned, and over my years of working with boards, sometimes is it's like, well, we're looking for the right superintendent who's going to, you know, fill in the blank, fix whatever the issues are that the district's dealing with at the time. And certainly the superintendent is the chief education, chief executive officer, but the board has to have some ownership in all of that too. And this relates, maybe we can talk about this in a little more detail, but this relates to the research NSBA did years ago on the key work of school boards, which basically said, look, by the way the boards act and where they prioritize their efforts, actually can have an impact on student achievement. And so I bring this up because if the board has a commitment to student achievement and wants to work in collaboration with the superintendent as the school education leader, then a lot of really good things can happen. And that has to be articulated in advance. So one of the questions I think a prospective superintendent needs to ask of the board, I mean, the questions could go back to the board. What's your vision about student achievement? Do you have high expectations for all students to learn, for example? And to have that conversation, because I think that will go a long way to determine whether this is going to be a good marriage or not. And I will say, of course, Dan, you and I have talked about this a lot. There's a lot of turnover on boards and in superintendents. So for sure, whoever's on the board that hires a superintendent may not all be there in a few years. But if there's a shared vision going in, it's more likely to carry over and hopefully be able to make that a successful team leading the school district.
To that point, Tom, we did some research at ASA a couple of years ago on, the tenure of the superintendents and the tenure of board members, and it's about the same.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
It's about the same. Yeah, the tenure of boards and superintendents are pretty much alike. So let me go to the next question then. So now the superintendent, and again, I think it's key because frankly, as you know, at ASA, we did so much work in trying to get superintendents in our aspiring superintendent program ready for the job. But a lot of individuals are so eager to become superintendent that they get offered a position and they take it because they feel this, I finally get to be a superintendent, and they don't last long,
Right.
unfortunately, because they never asked, the kinds of questions and inquired to make sure that there was a match there. So that's
Right.
a key point. But now let's say, okay, so now the superintendent is hired, they're working with the board. And again, you and I constantly talk about the management team. How do we work? How does the board and the superintendent, and what's the role that the superintendent should take as a leader in developing that management team between the superintendent and the board?
Well, I think a couple of thoughts come to mind immediately. One is it is important for the superintendent to get to know the members of the board. And I don't mean, necessarily socialize with them all the time or try to be their friends. In fact, I think there has to be a little bit of a separation generally, but it helps to know sort of what drives each board member, kind of how they process information, how they function, how they make decisions, kind of just get to know them and understand at some level some of the issues that they're dealing with. Just about every case, school board service is a part-time thing. It's not full-time. These people all have other lives and professional commitments and family issues they're dealing with and so on. And so they bring all of that, of course, to the board meeting. I mean, whatever else is going on in their lives. So I think it helps to know that a little bit. But the other thing, Dan, that I think is critically important, and I know you and I have talked about this a lot, is the need for boards and superintendents to take time to build a team. This is not this is not just add water and you've got a good team, right? Teamwork, it takes time, and it doesn't typically happen at the board meetings. I mean, you come in, you have an agenda, it's a long evening, there's a lot going on. Building a team, it means taking time away from the regular decision-making process, in my opinion. To do retreats, some of it obviously should be about the strategic direction of the district and issues that you're facing. Although I know there are obviously sunshine laws and there's some things that can't be done in private and shouldn't be. But building teams often is an exception in those public open meeting laws. And it's really important. And to that point, I would say I have found, and I think maybe you have, the superintendent has to take the lead. Generally has to say, look, it's really important that we do this, that we take some time. And in fact, I would even suggest, frankly, that a new superintendent being hired in the district would want that as one of the conditions, that the board is going to take time on some periodic basis to meet with the superintendent, maybe the superintendent's cabinet, however they want to structure that, to spend some time away from the normal decision-making process to build teams. One other thought about this, though, is that I think it's not just there that teamwork development has to happen. It's also important that boards uh, invest in their own professional development, and superintendents need to encourage that as well. So it may well be their state school boards association conference, an NSBA conference, or some other event. Um, but again, here too, I have found that if the superintendent doesn't kind of impress on the board the need to do this, it often doesn't happen. So, for example, and I'll just close with this, some superintendents that I've really admired, I noticed how they frame this question. They don't say, who wants to go to the state school board conference? It's which ones of you are going, right? There's a sort of an expectation that we're going to be there. And so not only then at that conference where you learn things, but you have time as a superintendent and some board members to go to sessions, maybe have dinner, talk about what you're hearing. All that also, I think, builds good teams.
Which, again, to our earlier question, important questions for a superintendent to ask when they're considering being hired by a board. Number one, that there will be professional development for the superintendent. We always advise that should be written in the contract. The organizations that they can join, like AASA, the state organization, and others. And then a second one, to the point of developing the team, and it is team building. So if the board and the superintendent are going to be the management team, there needs to be team building. I always felt, because I did that every year as a superintendent with my boards, is that I hired a facilitator. Yes, I took the lead to organize the event and to create it, etc. But I always felt that I wanted a facilitator, somebody trained in group dynamics and facilitating groups, to come in and run the sessions for us. Is that something that you agree with?
Totally. I mean, there may be some times where the superintendent and the board can just meet to work through some kind of an issue, but the kind of team building that we're talking about, absolutely agree. The superintendent needs to be able to participate in that session and not just be leading it or just because there's a very different role there. And so I'm sure each of us have done this over our careers where we've helped facilitate these kinds of discussions. And I've always found it to be really rich. And it's a good role then because somebody else is sort of asking maybe the tough questions that need to be brought up in a neutral way and to kind of facilitate the discussion. And by the way, another reason that I think this is important on an ongoing basis is the very point, Dan, that you just made a moment ago. There's turnover on boards, right? So even during a superintendent's tenure, the board members are going to change, hopefully not too rapidly and in some dramatic way. But as we've often said, when even one member of the board changes, the board has just changes. The dynamics on the board have changed. And so that's why the team building is important. And it's also, and I just want to be really blunt about this, it's also important for those new board members coming on because if you have regular kinds of retreats or team building sessions, and I know we will just say there are some outlier board members, we can talk about them. But for most new board members who come on, I think they want to do right by the district and by the kids. And so they come to these meetings and they start understanding there's a culture to the school district. There's sort of a way we do things around here. There's the values and shared beliefs that we have.
And a small point to that last remark, the orientation that new board members should have is an event that should be orchestrated jointly by the board chair and the superintendent together to bring that individual in and provide that individual with an orientation prior to their first meeting on.
And I will say, you mentioned some superintendents who perhaps take the position sooner than maybe they were prepared to or something. And again, look, I've worked literally with thousands of school board members, as I like to say, literally from coal miners to astronauts and everything in between. And again, I think that's part of the richness of school board. But I've also have to say I've run into school board members who were newly elected. I talked to them, hey, so why did you run for the school board? Well, maybe they had an issue, but I'm shocked at the number of people that I've met over the years who got elected to the school board who very rarely even went to a school board meeting, or maybe one or two, right? So they really had no idea, honestly, of what was going on in the district at some level. And again, I want to be clear, I don't think that's certainly the majority, but we have to recognize that people don't have a long runway when they get onto a school board or when they become a superintendent. Decisions have to be made very quickly. And even in a rural school district, and obviously we have thousands of those, but in districts of any size, typically the school board, or the school district rather, is the largest or one of the largest employers, has one of the biggest budgets, one of the most complex operations. So you can't just say, well, take your time on the school board, take a year or two, kind of get comfortable. No, probably your second or third meeting, if even that long, you're going to be making some really big, important decisions. People have to be prepared, and we can't just assume it's going to happen.
Just as a side note, an anecdote. When I was 32 years old, I left my wonderful job at BOCES because I wanted to start working my way. So I applied for an assistant superintendency. I got it. 6 months into the job, the superintendent that hires me gets fired. And now I'm saying, oh my God, I had this great job at BOCES, and now I apply for this. A new guy's going to come in, or lady, it's going to come on board, and they're going to bring their own. What do I do? So I decided to apply for the superintendency just to get in front of the board so they would know who I am, right? So they gave me the courtesy interview after they had interviewed all these experienced superintendents. And lo and behold, that evening, as I'm going home, feeling great about myself because, wow, I got to meet the board and establish a relationship. The board chair calls me and says, Dan, you got the job.
Right.
Now, talk about somebody being totally unprepared to be a superintendent. The board, we called them secretary in those days. The superintendent's secretary was this lady by the name of Eleanor Free, who had been in that job for 25 years. So my first day on the job, I sit there across from Eleanor. I said, Eleanor, I'm petrified. I don't know what to do. She said, young man, don't worry. I can run the district for you till you get the hang of it.
I love it. I love it. Yeah.
And she did.
Yeah.
And she did. So let's get back now to the point of what happens now when conflict, as it will happen eventually, develops between the superintendent and the board. What's the thing to do then?
Well, let me first say that beyond just that one type of conflict or disagreement, there's likely to be disagreements among the board members about a lot of issues. And here I've often said, and I don't think I protected this in any legal way, so you're free to steal it. But I've often told boards, you're not dysfunctional if you disagree. You're dysfunctional if you can't make a decision. So I think some disagreement within the board is actually a healthy thing. I mean, if what I said before is true, and I believe it is, that school boards should kind of represent a cross section of society and so on, people in the community should feel like their interests are being represented on the board. Well, then, of course, there are going to be some times that they don't all agree. And if it's a 9-member board and you have 5-4 vote on some issue, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Where it becomes a problem is if that's sort of the trend, like everything is a split vote. Or some issue with the superintendent is kind of, representing a larger sort of relationship problem. And I think that's part of what I would get to then, Dan, on your specific question, is what was the basis for the disagreement? I mean, it could be that it was entirely healthy. They just view things differently than the superintendent did, and they need to work through it. That's fine. But what I think can sometimes happen is this becomes sort of a marker for a bigger problem, that the board is becoming dissatisfied in some way. And, 2020 hindsight kind of applies here. I think there's some superintendents that we've known over the years who have lost their jobs, and looking back, saw some things that maybe they should have picked up on earlier. Uh, and so part of this, I think, is understanding, not in a defensive way necessarily, but if you presented as a superintendent a proposal to the board that was not accepted or a number of members disagreed with, is to try to understand really why they voted against what you wanted. What was the issue, and were there something else you could have done, other information you could have provided? Because I think you can start sensing then whether this is just about that issue. Um, I think I took one psychology class in undergrad, and so the one thing I remember, this is dangerous, is the concept of the presenting issue and the underlying issue. But this definitely applies here, right? I mean, sometimes it's really just a difference of opinion. Other times it's something much deeper. And so I think it can be helpful for the superintendent to talk to the board members who disagree for some reason. But look, the other thing I'd have to say too, and this cuts both ways, is sometimes proposals or ideas are brought before a school board that also aren't quite ready for the board's consideration. And if a board feels like it's been blindsided by something, or they weren't ready for it, or they didn't have the information that they expected to get, it's not likely to go the way the superintendent might want. And again, Dan, I know I've talked about this over the years, but this is sort of goes right to the heart of the board superintendent relationship, is how the superintendent addresses the board and deals with it as a leadership team. What kind of information can we do to set the table to make some of these important decisions? And the board, ultimately, whether it's about a building project or a curriculum issue, whatever it is, the board feels ownership. And I want to really stress that. Not just that the board approved it, but the board owns it as well. It was the superintendent's proposal, but the board now owns it because they voted its approval. And I'll just say, this is one example I would give at some of these board retreats. You were at the board meeting last night, and I don't know, you refinanced the bond. I don't, whatever it is, some big decision. And you're in the dairy aisle, you're picking up the milk, and somebody comes up to you and goes, "Hey, you're on the school board, right?" And I go, "Yeah, I understand last night you voted to fill in the blank. What was that about, or why did you make that decision?" And if the board member goes, "You'd have to talk to the superintendent about the details." So you're just admitting as a school board member, you really don't know what the heck's going on, and you don't want that as a superintendent either. You want that board member to be able to say, "Yeah, no, we decided last night to do this thing." And that sends a powerful message to the community about the board and the superintendent being a team.
Tom, how great it's been to have this conversation with you again. And of course, we've done this so many times, we could go on for hours. I think we've just, covered the
Right.
surface. But clearly, I think the point here that you and I have made forever, both for the board and the superintendent, that it's a growth process, and professional development is important. And just like in a marriage, sometimes when conflict develops, having some counseling for both the board and the superintendent is very important. So thank you so much for joining us. And Bill, I turn it back to you, my friend.
Dan, Tom, thank you very much. We all know that today's challenges are more complex than ever before school boards and before superintendents. And as I listened to you, it struck me that superintendents and boards functioning as a management team is not something they necessarily naturally know how to do. And Tom, you mentioned often you go to retreats. I want to offer to the audience that are listening to us today, if any of the districts out there, either pushed by the superintendent or board, or hopefully by them together, we'd like to have a retreat and have the two of you come. I'd love to have the two of you be available to do that. And so if people have an interest in that, I'm going to ask them just send me an email, and I'll get to Tom and Dan and put you together with them. My email would be bdaggett, just my name, bdaggett, at spnetwork.com. org. So just send me an email. And Dan, the other issue that we talked about, especially in the first podcast we did, beyond the board, the superintendent's got to know how to work with that cabinet. And I want to offer Dan up as a person who can help you come in, sit down with that superintendent, both the new superintendent and the established superintendent, trying to figure out a better way to effectively have somebody work with them and their board to hit on 8 cylinders. Also contact us. And Tom and Dan, I think you could be a great resource across the country. To all of you, this is our second podcast. Our third one's going to be on AI, and Dan will be interviewing me about AI and the incredible opportunities this actually brings to superintendents, principals, maybe most importantly, classroom teachers, to give them their nights and weekends back. It can become their assistant if you know how to do it. It also is something we got to pay a whole lot of attention to because especially at the classroom level, AI enables the kids to, quotes, from our perspective, cheat on our instructional practices. How do you deal with that? But the third thing we'll talk about in that podcast is AI is changing the workplace, home, and society profoundly. And it's changing the skills, knowledges, and attributes our students are going to need to be successful in that changing workplace. And we'll talk about those. So let me bring this podcast to close by Tom. Thank you for being our guest today. Dan, thanks for continuing being the co-host. And ladies and gentlemen, let us know if we can help you. Thanks. Have a great day.